Hello and a very warm welcome to today's Science Education Academy lecture. My name is Tini Matis, and if we haven't met before, I have the wonderful role of being the PVC for Education here at UNSW and will be your sort of MC for today at the beginning and the end. As I welcome you, I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining from our Kensington campus and acknowledge the Bejigal people who are the traditional custodians of this land. And because this is a very well attended online event, also acknowledging all the traditional custodians of the many lands that you will be joining us from. And I would like to pay my respects to all the elders past and present and all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues that are joining us for this lecture today. It is an absolute pleasure to welcome you to the Science Education Academy lecture series, which is a forum of true thought leadership that is hosted by our wonderful UNSW Science Education Fellows. If you don't know much about the Academy, we have about 40 fellows that have been appointed across all of our faculties at UNSW, and they are our most outstanding educators who not only share a genuine passion to inspire students, but also to champion educational excellence through their vision and expertise. In other words, they are our true brains trust of educational excellence at UNSW and beyond. That's why these Science Education lectures are always such a special treat, and today will certainly be no exception. Through these lectures, the Academy raises important current issues and often sparks high-level conversations about the future of learning, teaching, and higher education, and turns these challenges into actionable opportunities. These public lectures have been running since 2018, and each one has been recorded and shared on our education website, and the team's going to share a link in a minute. So whether you want to revisit or catch up, that's where you can do it. Now, today's Science Education Academy the Science Education Academy is absolutely delighted to host our Associate Professor Silas Taylor, who is a fellow and associate professor in the Faculty of Medicine and Health. Silas will be speaking today on the topic of the return of conversation, communication performance, and the future of university assessment. I'm personally really looking forward to the topic as it straddles two critical elements of education here at UNSW: how to develop meaningful human future-focused skills, such as communication in our students, but also how to validly assess students' learnings of these skills. So before we get to the fun part, I just have a few virtual housekeeping notes for everyone, please. This lecture is being recorded and will be made available on the website, and again, the link will be shared with you. In terms of the order of events, Silas will present for about 40 minutes, followed by a brief Q&A session. So please take your time to join the conversation and participate in the lecture by posting your questions in the Q&A function and comments that you might have in the chat, and you can also upvote other people's questions if you like. With that, I will now pass to Professor Alberto Motta, who is not only the Deputy Dean for Education and Student Experience in the Business School, but also the Director of the UNSW Science Academy, and also Terry Cummins, who is the Deputy Dean, not the Deputy Dean, the Deputy Director. And at the same time, she is also an Education Fellow for UDL. In ADA, she is the Academic Lead Education in the Disability Innovation Institute and a Fellow and Deputy Director of the Academy. So a very busy woman. Over to you both. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tini, for the kind words, and thanks everybody for coming. I think we are close to record numbers of people online. I can see 300, which is really, really good. Thanks so much for taking the time. My role here is literally to just introduce the two deputy directors of the Science Education Academy, Professor Karen Maras, School of Education, who has helped organize this event as the event's stream leader in the Science Education Academy, but couldn't be here today. And so representing her is Terry Cumming, also School of Education, also Deputy Director, Science Education Academy, and lead of our education stream in the Science Education Academy. After all this introduction, let me just pass it to Terry to introduce the speaker. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Tini and Alberto. It is my pleasure today to be able to introduce our colleague, Associate Professor Silas Taylor. Silas, as Tini said, is a UNSW Faculty of Medicine and Health Nexus Fellow, Senior Fellow of Advanced Higher Education, Fellow of the Scientia Education Academy, and recipient of a UNSW Vice Chancellor's Award for Teaching Excellence. Silas's work focuses on communication, performance, assessment, and graduate capability development across higher education. Drawing on more than 2 decades of experience in medical education, he has led initiatives in simulation, workplace-based assessment, oral assessment, digital assessment platforms, and technology-enhanced learning. He's currently involved in cross-disciplinary work exploring authentic assessment, graduate readiness, and the role of communication in assuring professional competence. Quite the mouthful. I am going to turn it over now to you, Silas. Looking very much forward to listening to you speak.
And I will, yes, there we go. Thank you so much. Thanks, Tinny, our Provost Chancellor Education, Alberto and Terry, and Karen too, in absentia, my colleagues and the co-directors of the Scientia Education Academy. How many fellows does it take to give a lecture? Today I'm 3 in 1, as Terry has indicated. A proud fellow of the Scientia Education Academy, as of 2018, appointed to the Senior Fellow Advanced HE in 2019, and in the last 3 years also a Nexus Fellow. And in this talk I will cover 20 years of work, and much of that has been significantly updated in the last 3, primarily due to the affordance of the Nexus Fellowship, where I've been able to dedicate significant time to this and other important educational challenges and opportunities. You see on my title screen the title, but this talk is fundamentally about human interaction and the necessary communication capability that is required to foster effective interaction, and how I see that as becoming much more important across the board in university programs, due to what I will describe as a confluence of forces, and consequently how we might teach and assess in future as a result. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians, the Gumbaynggirr people of the unceded land on which I live and work, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and also extend my respects to other Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders in the audience today. Thank you all, and thank you everyone for attending. So I think it was mentioned I have previously given a Scientia Education Academy. Some time has passed, it's 2019. And I think back then, we all agreed that communication skills, oral communication skills, and the broader capability thereof was important. So I discussed the work that I had done, and perhaps with an overly strong focus on the technology specifically, and tried to illustrate how it might be used to address a requirement, as I saw it, to specifically develop oral communication skills in students from other programs. However, apart from 1 or 2 important exceptions, most people thought, on balance, it did not matter enough to them or their students at that time. Today I return to this, and that perhaps the work done in the teams that I've led is of increased and perhaps now even urgent relevance to colleagues across the institution, even perhaps the entire higher education sector. And I base that belief on many meetings I've had with colleagues over the last 2 to 3 years, and that in those meetings people are actively seeking advice and guidance in this area. And that's hence why I thought this talk might be timely. Because undoubtedly, since 2019, the world has changed. This is the convergence of forces I mentioned earlier, and And no doubt, we're all familiar with Gen AI, exposing existing flaws in assessment practices across the board. Those widened flaws then raise and intensify assurance concerns, but also raise questions from the employability perspective as to how well graduates can perform when they move from university to the workplace. Hence, I will argue today that, that human oral communication may have been somewhat overlooked by educators, and more than that, it becomes strategically visible and important because performance and employability need to be demonstrated. Now, if you've only got a short time, that's pretty much the talk in a nutshell. I hope you can stick with me. If you have a little more time, I'll initially like to set up the problem by focusing in on these three forces in a little more detail, many of which may be keeping you, amongst myself included, a little restless at night. So we know that Gen AI has exposed, and the sort of guide up the top right to show you where we are. So focusing on Gen AI, we know that it has exposed fragility in traditional assessment, especially written products of all kinds. We see every day scholarly outputs about the impact of AI on assessment. This is a recent publication coming from the postgraduate medical education field, but I'm certain that you're familiar with similar articles emanating from your own disciplinary areas and more widely across higher education too. So looking at that sector more broadly, Kylie Moore-Gilbert made headlines in May of this year, writing in the Sydney Morning Herald a piece that questioned the traditional value of an undergraduate degree today, telling her stepdaughter to think twice before going to uni. That's a discussion, I might add, that is actively going on in my own family, with both my teenage children involved to a greater or lesser extent with the HSE currently, and trying to forecast their future work and prepare well for that, and explicitly asking whether university is the best option for them. And that's in a family, I'm an associate professor, my wife is a professor, and we have very much benefited from university education, and not least my wife, who was first in family to attend and graduate from a university not so long ago. In the upcoming Festival of Dangerous Ideas, the blurb dramatically states, students are disengaged, universities are businesses first, and places of learning second, and young people are under pressure to accumulate credentials, while employers complain that they lack the skills, resilience, and curiosity to thrive. I note some other notable speakers previously of this place at that event, worth a look. So the pressure is on, and no more so when we look at assurance of learning. Just try and get my slides to, there we go. So the need for secure assessment, more diverse forms of assessment, and the aspiration for program level assurance, including the quixotic notion of programmatic assessment, make this a practical and urgent challenge rather than an abstract one. Here we see excerpts from the recent publication out of University of New South Wales, the Assessment and Progression Policy, just in case you don't recognise it and wish to delve more deeply. And that specifically calls out these elements of assessment design in future. And notably, makes special mention of oral assessment, to which we shall return. Looking at that employability issue, initially at the institutional level, we start to see a number of conversations in different areas of the university pointing in a similar direction. Let's start with the UNSW strategy, the value statements. I've called out collaboration and displaying respect here, while in the skills passport coming out of Faculty of Arts, Design and Architecture, which I understand is due to be introduced for degrees across the institution, and which specifically names communication skills as an area that they suggest students might show evidence for and in. Whilst a recent Nexus report on work-integrated learning and industry-ready learning, which I had the pleasure of being involved in creating, and noting Andrew Dimmock's from business, his great leadership in that work. We pulled together multiple reports and lists on the likes of future-focused skills for tomorrow's graduates, and repeatedly communication featured highly there. So these three independent sources of institutional movement point to collaboration, respect, professional capability, evidence, I would claim, through oral communication. At a global scale, we see headlines being made in the Wall Street Journal by Northeastern University. They're claiming applications are soaring as new student degrees integrate up to 18 months of full-time paid employment. Back in my home country, the UK, where my friend and colleague Jen Hammond, the Vice President for Teaching, Learning and Students at Manchester University, in a plan aimed squarely at public increasing scepticism of the value of degrees, is considering every degree to include work experience to help ensure students, quote, thrive after graduation. And of course, UNSW is #1 in Australia for employability. Our WIL team work very hard and are active in this area, and it's important. And we want to hold on to and strengthen that #1 spot. So at this point, I want to head off any sense of false dichotomy. We're talking here about knowledge and capability, not one versus the other. I know that Merlin Crosley, our Deputy Vice-Chancellor Academic Quality, is rightly strong on the importance of knowledge development in degrees. And of course, knowledge has always been foundational in medicine, but that parallel importance of skills has long been acknowledged and addressed. So let's turn our attention now to communication. What am I talking about here? For me, oral communication is more than information exchange, and the foundation is the relationship. I use the maxim you see on the slide here on a poster throughout my skills centre to really remind students, the words are there, but the sentiment I think is you can be as clever as you like, but if it helps no one if you cannot communicate effectively. And indeed, I'll go further and make the broader claim that all professional performance depends on human interaction. It's as true in other programs as it is in medicine, and I say it goes beyond the traditionally vocational degrees. The specifics differ, the human requirements recur. Let's take some examples. The health professional, yes, in our faculty we now encompass several other health professions. The lawyer in the client interview, the engineer briefing their clients, and the business person in a stakeholder situation, stakeholder meeting. In all these situations, people want to be heard, respected, and taken seriously. I had an interesting conversation with a colleague who did computer science as a degree recently, and we agreed that having had no training in oral communication during the degree was a problem when it came to both clearly understanding client needs, but also in communicating technical solutions back to the client. Richard Buckland, UNSW's Director of First Year Experience and another Scientia Education Academy Fellow, talks about bringing it back to a level where technical and professional expertise can be understood. Or as Dr. Katie Lim on a video I'll play shortly says, it's important in patient interactions to be using, quotes, simple language that's easy to understand. And here I want to connect the conceptual claim to employability. Looking at our Nexus WIL report, just up in the top right there again, I was struck that many of the frequently listed future employability skills require human communication in order to be visible. Empathy, critical thinking, leadership, collaboration, stakeholder engagement, and adaptability are evidenced by communication. So communication is not one skill among many, but the medium through which many capabilities are demonstrated. So across the board, we see agreement that the communication capability is important. Employers want it. Professional bodies and accrediting bodies such as the Australian Medical Council, but many others too, require it. And universities have always claimed it. So again, important to stress here, I'm not arguing universities currently ignore communication. I'm arguing we have largely assumed oral communication capability rather than systematically developing and evidencing it. So the issue is not whether communication matters, but how evidence is generated and assured. Now, for those of you who've been around even half as long as I have, you may by now be asking, have we heard this before? And due to Professor Sophie Arkoudis and Dr. Anne Harris's 2018 report for the now defunct Office for Learning and Teaching, the answer is emphatically yes. Arkoudis described the distributed expertise model in this paper, suggesting that threshold standards be established, milestones be put in place, and evidence gathered and quality assurance processes put in place. The key point is that this was a whole of program assurance question before generative AI, assessment assurance, and the evolving employability agenda intensified the problem. But the distributed expertise model also has echoes in the work I have led. Threshold standards established such that students can comfortably and competently communicate effectively with simulated patients before real patient interactions. Milestones are in place with recurrent communication assessment across the first 2 years of our medicine program, before a summative oral clinical assessment acts as a barrier assessment before students move into much more substantial placements in clinical environments, where they will naturally be seeing and interacting with many more real patients. Evidence is captured in our portfolio system, and research that I've conducted supports the claim that communication standards are improving. To expand on that a little more, I'd welcome you to have a little look at this quite busy slide more closely. Here we see the work I have led, creating a learning ecosystem on the left and an assessment ecosystem on the right. Now, in the title, I also claim that medicine have been doing this for decades, and that is correct. The patient-centered approach is based upon the biopsychosocial turn that began in the late 1960s, and communication teaching became embedded in medicine programs globally from the 1980s onwards. So, peer practice and simulated patients are now common practice. But the teams I have led have innovated on this to extend into the online world with Ospia, and more recently using Gen AI generated virtual patients, primarily to practice skills prior to moving into real environments. I believe medicine has developed genuine expertise here, and these weren't isolated innovations. Together they became an ecosystem for learning and assessment, and on the right hand side, you'll see the assessment ecosystem where evidence is flowing in from those simulated patient interactions, whether they be in person or online, through into our portfolio, and that's augmented by interactions in the workplace. And what we've been able to do is achieve authenticity and at scale, and crucially, develop longitudinal evidence. So I'm proud to say that in the new medicine program that will be launched in 2028, this ecosystem will not only persist, but be further extended with twice as much clinical skills content in future, much of which will continue to focus on communication. So let's focus on communication skills development itself. What does that look like? At the base level, as previously mentioned, we have human communication, something I also refer to as interactional or generic communication skills. Things like active listening, paraphrasing, summarizing. And this supports the professional relationship where respect and mutual understanding are developed. This then critically supports professional communication, something that may also be termed disciplinary oracy, or just more simply, how we talk like a lawyer or an engineer or an artist or a business person, but hopefully without bamboozling people with jargon. And finally, we see the professional performance, where real-world impact occurs and outcomes can be measured. For those of you familiar with it, you may also spot echoes of the extended Miller's pyramid framework of assessment of clinical competence that moves from knows how, shows, does, and then at its peak, the is, which goes into that sort of deeper insight into professional identity itself. So let's see how the assessment ecosystem maps to the communication model. These are examples of infrastructure built to make authentic communication assessment feasible at scale. On campus, we've developed a fine simulated patient program. We're extremely fortunate to have a wonderful cohort of community volunteers who fulfill a crucial role in playing patients with whom students can interact in live sessions across our 3 campuses, in Sydney, Kensington, in Wagga, and near me on the mid-north coast at Port Macquarie. The success of our in-person simulated patient program inspired me to create Ospia, the online simulated patient interaction and assessment platform, which is available to all UNSW medicine students across the state, in which our community volunteers again play the role of patients for students to continue to practice their skills and get feedback without being tied to their timetable or a physical skills centre. From my research, we know it's effective and developmental. It's certainly scalable. We've had thousands of interactions over the last 5 years plus of using this particular platform. And it was specifically built to have very low administrative overhead. It's students, not staff, who organise and reorganise their own appointments, within specified limits, of course. Meanwhile, we also have the clinical workplace-based assessment application, bit of a mouthful, which can be used in many and varied professional environments, where students start to have their first real patient interactions supported and assessed by their supervisors in those clinical settings. As you'll appreciate, the technology is supporting the direction and level of communication being practiced, from that interactional human foundation through to professional communication in the workplace, the shows to does, maybe even is, and all sustainably in a scalable and equitable manner. But don't take my word for it. Here's some alumni from our program reflecting back on these processes now that they are doctors in busy clinical jobs.
Also a space where I learned to hone and try out different communication skills, and I realized that there's no one-size-fits-all approach. And also it also was a great avenue to practice my empathy and to connect with the patients on a human level, and then to not only develop my own empathy skills, but also to learn how to actually communicate this empathy to patients.
Feedback made me realize that I really enjoy talking to people. So it's not that surprising, I guess, that I ended up in psychiatry.
I think there's a lot that you can't learn just from books alone, that you can only get from genuine patient interactions. I would use a lot of technical jargon, and I remember one of the SPs telling me that I just needed to speak to her like how I would speak to like an aunt or a friend, and that I could just use normal everyday language. And nowadays, when I'm doing a lot of clinic and meeting a lot of patients, it's just something that I always try to keep in mind and make sure that I use simple language that's easy to understand.
Easy to understand. Casey was saying, I'm sorry about the ham-fisted editing. I hope you heard that. I'm having a slight panic that I hadn't allowed sound. But
also a space where...
Sorry, let's move on. So that admittedly is all in the medicine program. But now UNSW and the sector are turning their interest to oral assessment. There is now an institutional response to operational feasibility and to support oral assessment at scale. Here I'd like to really thank and acknowledge Nexus colleagues, particularly May Lim from engineering, Colin Priest too, who's been very important in our good oral assessment team, and the collaboration with Tracy Wilcox and Mark Ian Jones to get this going. Pilots in term 3 this year are going to be in the engineering faculty, with May herself in the engineering design and professional practice course. Again in medicine and health with my colleague Jana Lutz in dietetics. 2 courses in business school, global financial reporting and analysis, and data and ethics. That one's led by Tracy herself. And in the Faculty of Science, an interesting one for me, Jim Pettigrew in dynamical systems and chaos in maths. So I'm delighted to be working with PVCE to make this available across the university. It's trialled in UNSW environment. Basically, this platform is the OSPIA platform, just kind of rebadged. And it's with UNSW students. It's been used by UNSW students, and they're medical students. They're a demanding and picky lot, and I'm pretty confident that if it works for them, it'll work for others. And that it is scalable. In addition, it's sustainable, cost effective, and well tested. We also hear, of course, that students actually enjoy oral assessment and find it helpful in their future careers, as per the video you've just seen. And whilst pilots are being led by programs for whom employability is particularly pressing, others too besides have shown great interest, and again mentioning Jim in maths, where the ability to demonstrate mathematical reasoning and thinking like a mathematician is what he and his colleagues were hoping to assess. And again, let's be clear, the student oral assessment platform is not the whole solution, but it can be part of it. And please, for those of you who value and promote high quality writing, good on you. That's very important in our students. Please be reassured. Writing remains essential. Oral performance components can add evidence. It can just be of evidence of ownership, so a kind of integrity check. But having put in the effort, I think that many will quickly realise it can also, at the same time, be more than that. To test understanding and judgment, plus showing ability to perform in simulations that more closely represent work activities and real work life in the future. So this is a time to reflect for me, and it's the sort of long arc of my work, starting in medicine, beginning with in quite humble circumstances in a building off campus, an old house, as it were, as it was, and really feeling like some technology would help a little bit here. I was very lucky to move into a purpose-built centre, and luckier still to work with some fantastic people to start implementing that technology enhanced approach. So I see this as an opportunity to reframe oral assessment, perhaps a returning to practice. We've gone through the innovation cycle in medicine. I talked about some of that in 2019. We've seen, as I've said, the world change, and this convergence of forces, perhaps now renewing bringing in greater institutional relevance. Because we know that the world has changed, and we've got these quite different pressures operating at once. AI exposing that weakness in traditional assessment, intensifying the question of whether submitted work genuinely gives us sufficient evidence of individual achievement. The employability agenda asks a related question from another direction: can graduates actually perform when they leave UNSW? And assessment policy is making the assurance question much more explicit. Alone, these forces make a case for increased focus on communication skills and capability, but together they have made something that was previously perhaps rather too easy to overlook much harder to ignore. And that is the point at which oral communication becomes strategically interesting. So we've come at this from quite different directions: AI, assessment assurance, employability. And let's not forget those student and societal expectations about the value of a degree, recalling Kylie Moore-Gilbert's quotes, and, as I say, the discussions in my own home too. I think they ultimately bring us to a common question. How do universities and the wider community know that our graduates can actually perform? Not simply that they have completed the curriculum, got the degree, got the piece of paper. Not simply that they can produce an acceptable piece of assessed work, but that they can take what they know and use it, explain it, adapt it, and communicate in the situations in which it matters. And I think this is where oral communication, again, becomes really strategically important. It's where the impact of AI, necessary changes to assessment, and the employability agenda converge, with effective oral communication capability as the emerging theme. So what might this actually look like? I don't think the answer is that every student, and of course that would in turn mean every course convener, suddenly needs to be doing vivas. The more interesting question is what progressive communication capability might look like across a degree. Perhaps early on we need students to be able to explain an idea clearly, then to discuss it, respond to questions, defend a position, and eventually perform in more complex and authentic professional situations. The exact progression would obviously look different in different disciplines. A mathematician, engineer, lawyer, health professional will not demonstrate these things in the same way, but I think the developmental principle is remarkably transferable. Explain, discuss, respond, defend, perform. And by the way, I'm not suggesting these are 5 different types of oral assessment. They're 5 increasingly demanding forms of professional communication. And again, that sort of echoes the extended Miller's pyramid I mentioned, an important distinction. Deepening judgment, increasing complexity, greater responsibility. But developing capability isn't the same thing as ensuring it, and we need both. The first part of this talk has really been about the human and educational foundations. Communication creates the relationship through which professional expertise can be used. The second challenge is institutional. How do we accumulate enough evidence across a program to be confident that the capability has been developed? That's where assessment and our KUDIS's milestone standards and longitudinal evidence become important. So I'm interested in oral assessment not just because it's secure, not just because it's authentic, and not just because students and educators may come to love it, but because it can become part of a larger system of evidence. And that brings me back to the proposition that's really emerged from this work, that communication is where expertise becomes visible. That is true in a consultation, it's true in an engineering briefing, it's true in a client interview, it's true in research discussion, and increasingly, I think it needs to be true in our assessment processes and systems as well. So I'm not ending with a recommendation that every degree introduce oral assessment. I don't think we're there, and we may never need to be. I'm ending with a proposition that I'd like you to challenge. If communication is where expertise becomes visible, universities have a responsibility not simply to value communication, but to develop it and provide credible evidence that students have achieved it. Now, this raises some difficult questions. Where in a degree should we develop and assess it? What evidence should we accumulate? How much evidence is enough? And what should count as convincing evidence in different disciplines? And there's one other question I've only obliquely addressed today. What does this look like from the student's perspective? Could a UNSW degree increasingly make a visible promise, not just about what students will know, but about what they will do, communicate, and demonstrate by the time they graduate? For me, I think that's something that would keep UNSW in that #1 for employability spot. 20 years ago, evidencing oral communication skills and capability was largely a medical education problem. Doctors needed to be able to communicate with patients, and so medical students needed to develop and be assessed on that. Over those years, the teams I have led have implemented, iterated, and developed innovative ways of teaching, practicing, assessing, and assuring that capability. I hope I've made it clear today, I don't think the question now is whether every discipline should copy medicine. The question is a broader one, and it's whether universities are entering a period in which we need to take the development and assurance of human oral communication much more seriously, because it is through communication that knowledge becomes usable, expertise becomes visible, and professional capability becomes demonstrable. That's the proposition I leave you with today. I would just quickly like to thank many people, Louise and Boaz, who helped me develop this these slides and the lecture overall. There are many, many other people I would like to thank. Kieran Thwaites, notably, Callie Spencer, May Lim, as I've already mentioned, others in the GOAT team, the Nexus program, Patsy Polly leading that, and all of my wonderful colleagues in that program, Tracy and Mark, who've made the SOA work possible, and many others over the years. Some of these people have left the university even years and years ago, but were absolutely instrumental in the work that I have done. Thank you very much. And thanks all very much for attending today. I look forward to some questions.
Thank you so much, Silas. That was absolutely fabulous. Of course, the downside of having this large online event is that you can't hear the clapping, but hopefully you can see it on the screen. I'm also not sure that whether you can see the avalanche of questions that have come in. We'll do our very best to go through them all, but just to give you a flavor, Silas, of the types of questions, quite a few around how AI impacts both the need for communication skills, but also how we might go about assessing it, and naturally a little bit of a spill into the AI and assessment insurance thing more broadly. Quite a few practical questions indicating that the audience would like to know of how to actually do this. So if it's okay, we'll start with the most upvoted questions first, and not surprisingly, that's about the scalability of this. Sonia's asking if you could explain a little bit more about how oral assessment is scalable with limited course staff in large courses with hundreds or even thousands of students.
Yep. So let's not downplay that problem. Thousands of students is certainly a serious challenge. What I can say is that working from my own experience, where I have at point 600 medical students with whom I'm conducting communications assessments, something, there's a couple of ways. So the in-person program really required a complete overhaul of my teaching approach. And I did that back in 2014, kindly assisted by my wonderful colleague Renee Lim. We just completely overhauled the curriculum. And we went out and looked for people who could be engaged in our program. Now, that may not work for everybody, but what I think will work for many is the online version. So as I talked about the Aspia platform, the underlying technology is now the same. It's the same platform, basically, that we are beginning to test and learn from in the student oral assessment platform. And so I'm very confident that we can have hundreds of students being assessed in that environment. And also, very importantly, and believe me, I would have never ever have embarked on the Aspia platform if I had to do the administrative work. I wouldn't put it on a professional staff colleague, and I wouldn't want it on myself. So that platform had first and foremost, I mean, apart from, good educational design, but first and foremost, it was really the sustainability and the administrative overhead that we targeted first. So students, as I said in the talk, they make their own appointments, and that is all handled within the platform with no input from me as a course convener. So I hope that goes some way to helping people understand how this works. Like I say, SOA is not the whole answer, but it can be part of a wider solution.
Excellent. Thank you very much. There's also very practical questions, including could there be a walkthrough of the online tool? I think that's beyond us in the next 8 minutes, but I hear a follow-up lecture coming up here. If I may now move to a couple of questions that are around the skill of communication in particular. We've got one question that's asking, does what you're presenting mean that the growing importance of communication creates new equity issues for students who may have strong ideas but less confidence in academic or professional language?
Yeah, and I fully acknowledge the sort of wider equity issue here. This is not trivial by any means, and I guess what I would say is it requires careful design and also reasonable adjustment. I think we need to be careful that we're not avoiding assessment of a capability that is genuinely required in professional practice. That doesn't solve any equity problem. So the key distinction is between the kind of irrelevant barriers and communication capability that's genuinely intrinsic to the outcome being assessed. I think we need to be aware that our kind of ELS would need to also upskill in what are the requirements that could be, what are the adjustments that may need to be put in place. but yeah, we also, as educators, we need to think, when would this be most appropriate? When does it genuinely tally with professional requirements?
Mm-hmm. If we could now turn to the questions that are more about AI impacting the way we assess students. So there's some that are specific about oral assessments. The one that got the most votes is asking about the threat of meta glasses and AI-linked hearing aids, earpods, and so forth to speak during a oral assessment. And then another one that is based on another type of assessment, very common in medicine that you mentioned, can AI affect the effectiveness of portfolios as an evidence base? So two different questions, both on how is AI messing with this?
Let's go with the Meta glasses, now available at your local Kmart for less than $100, much to all of our consternation. I mean, yes, look, I hope, first of all, that we will see some regulation in this area. You know, just on a societal level, I think it's problematic if we're constantly under surveillance and now non-consensual surveillance much more feasible. With, you know, I'll use some frank language. Students have always cheated, and we will never catch all the cheats. And so, let me just be clear, a tiny minority of students have always cheated. So, will students attempt to use AI augmented devices? Yes, of course, that will happen. And of course, it raises really difficult questions about, you know, we used to be able to look at the product of assessment and question whether, you know, that was genuinely the student's work. Now, with these sorts of technologies, we have the real challenge that the problem is the student and, you know, the augmentation of the student themselves. So quite how we get round that, and certainly particularly mindful of, you know, personal privacy, equity, those sorts of things, they are difficult questions. And again, I'm not saying anything here today that is solving that problem. I think, again, what I'm pointing to is, you know, being part of a solution, not the solution. But yeah, I appreciate that those technologies are troublesome. Programmatic assessment and AI. I'm wondering what the question really means. Is this sort of the production of multiple genuine looking assets going into a portfolio, perhaps something like that? Yep, I think
the specific wording is, do you think AI could also affect the effectiveness of a portfolio as evidence?
Yeah. I guess if the portfolio data is accumulated through our own systems that we have close oversight on, I think that we could try to, you know, look at that problem if it arises through careful management of our own systems. I think where portfolios are kind of you know, I guess I'm thinking of the two different types of portfolios. We have the sort of showcase of student work, but in medicine we use a more structured portfolio where we make the requirements and the students need to fulfill them. I think that's a safer, securer form of e-portfolio, whereas the showcase is probably more amenable to augmentation with AI created products. So yeah, not something, I'll confess, that I've had to struggle with thinking about at this point.
I think we have time for two more questions. One is a quick one that can where you can give a plug. Is there a community of practice or the like for oral assessment?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, it's kind of happening anyway. We haven't badged it as a community of practice yet, but I suspect it probably needs to be. Yeah, I know Maylim has been enormously active in this area. We've been a great group working together on this in Nexus. May's very busy with other things as well, I know. And so taking on, any of us taking on a lead of a community of practice at this stage is something we need to think seriously about. Yes, I would see something like that probably eventuating.
The last one is a philosophical question, but I have to sort of limit you to maybe 2 or 3 sentences to answer that one. Where should the line be drawn between a student mastering their core discipline and mastering the ability to communicate it? Should a brilliant specialist be denied a degree if they struggle to communicate their knowledge?
It's a lovely question, and it's actually genuinely something that I've thought about. When I think about medicine, we have a number of specialties within medicine, not all of which require patient contact, for example. And so, I remember a colleague at med school who I went through with who was laser focused on becoming a pathologist, really because he actually just wanted to avoid having too much contact with patients, frankly. But all of us land in workplaces that rely on good communication for any amount of work to happen. I mentioned in the lecture the conversation I had with a colleague who did computer skills, and he was lamenting that had he been taught more about how to effectively interact with clients, that that it would probably have been helpful to that career. So yeah, it's an interesting question, and where is the line? I'm not sure I'm going to be able to determine today.
Thank you so much, Silas. You've certainly in your lecture given us a fabulous example where knowledge and excellent communication come together for a really impactful hour for all of us. So thank you very much for taking the time. Thank you to everyone online for joining us. We've got lots more questions that we couldn't answer, but I think the team is putting together a bit of a question and answer sheet to be shared afterwards. And I think we have one final slide. If you do have a spare moment, you can scan the QR code and give us feedback of what you about today's lecture. So we wish you a lovely afternoon, all the best, and thank you very much, especially to Silas, but also to the almost 400 people that took the time to join us online today. Thank you very much.
Thanks all. Thank you.